Welcome to the principal source audio presentation of The Epistemology of Perception by David Kelley. Perception is the foundation of knowledge and the source of everything we know. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies the nature, acquisition, and validation of knowledge. To make the connection between perception and the rest of our knowledge, for example, to form concepts, we need a set of guidelines to understand the nature of this integration. The Epistemology of Perception fills this gap. In part one of this talk, Dr. Kelley tackles the questions that skeptics have used to challenge the reliability of the senses, such as illusions and other specific phenomena, by distinguishing between what we perceive and how we perceive, between the object and the form in which we are aware of the object. Part two takes up another important distinction in epistemology, the distinction between sensation and perception. A well-known philosopher, teacher, and writer, David Kelley earned his Ph.D. in philosophy from Princeton University in 1975. He has since taught philosophy, cognitive sciences, and other courses at Vassar College and Brandeis University. Dr. Kelley's books include The Evidence of the Senses, The Art of Reasoning, and A Life of One's Own, Individual Rights and the Welfare State. He was recently featured on John Stossel's ABC TV news special, Greed, and is a popular lecturer and talk show guest. Dr. Kelley is founder and, since 1990, the executive director of the Institute for Objectivist Studies in Poughkeepsie, New York. This lecture was given in 1985 at the Jefferson School Conference. There, Dr. Kelley presented an illuminating exposition of perception as a basic level of cognition that stands between conceptual knowledge and sensations, and which is a cardinal principle in the Objectivist Theory of Epistemology.
The topic for today is the epistemology of perception. Now, last time I talked about the foundations of epistemology. We talked about certain fundamental principles, such as the primacy of existence, or the fact that consciousness has an identity. And these apply to all areas of epistemology. They apply to any issue you might want to raise. Today we're going to look a little more closely specifically at perception. These topics that I'm going to talk about certainly won't cover the whole of perceptual epistemology. They're drawn from my book, The Evidence of the Senses. So this, in a way, will be kind of a preview of the book. It's been approved for general audiences. So if there are any children here, you needn't take them out. This outline here will give you kind of a road map of the lecture. That's your physical map. This is your philosophical map. And I will try to indicate where we are roughly as we're going along. Now, before I begin on the issues of perceptual epistemology, I want to talk about a prior question, which is, why is there such an area to begin with? Why are there any epistemological issues about perception? Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that studies the nature, the acquisition, and the validation of knowledge. So epistemology has two broad goals. One is to understand the basic relationships between knowledge and reality. Okay? Now, the fundamental relationship is the primacy of existence. But there are many questions of a more specific nature. For example, how are concepts formed? How do they relate to objects in the world? What exactly in reality do concepts stand for? Or, how do the procedures of inductive inference identify the causal relations between objects and actions? Or, how do we grasp axiomatic facts? This is a branch of epistemology we had to use last time. Okay, so the first goal is one of understanding. The second goal of epistemology is to offer guidelines for acquiring and validating knowledge. Okay, as we saw last time, consciousness is epistemologically active. It's an active process that integrates and differentiates the content that we derive from our senses. Now, at the conceptual level, these processes are largely conscious and voluntary. Okay? Conceptual thinking is self-initiated and it's self-directed. And as a result, we can make mistakes. There's no giant textbook of life with all the answers in the back so that we can see whether we did the problems right. The conclusions we arrive at are only as good as the processes by which we arrived at them. Now, since we're responsible for that activity, we need standards. Standards, for example, for defining concepts, standards for forming new concepts, standards for making valid inferences and testing scientific hypotheses, and so on. We need epistemology to provide those standards. In this respect, epistemology is a normative discipline. It gives us rules, guidelines, ways of telling better from worse ways of functioning. Okay, now let's turn to perception. Perception involves the direct awareness of objects in the environment. And by direct, I mean it is not based on any prior awareness of those objects. Perception is not derived from a prior state of awareness by any conscious process. Okay? And perception is automatic. Okay? It happens automatically. We can choose whether or not to look in a given direction. We can choose whether to open our eyes or not. But once we've opened our eyes in a certain direction, we don't get to choose what we're going to see. Okay, now I should stress that I'm talking here about perception, not about perceptual judgments that we might make on the basis of perception. For example, I'm talking about your actual sensory experience of this room, not your conceptual identification of it as a room, as a lecture room, as a place you most want to be right now, as a place you least like to be right now, or whatever. Okay? Conceptual identifications of that sort are not direct or automatic, not in the way perception is. And because perception is direct and automatic, it may seem that there are no epistemological questions to be raised about it. Why not? Well, for one thing, there's no particular problem about the relationship between perception and its objects. You know, in the area of concepts, we have to do some thinking to figure out what it is that concepts stand for. Concept man is an abstraction. What is it in reality, since we don't see any abstractions, that the concept stands for? But in the case of perception, the object is right in front of your nose. It's whatever you're seeing. There's the object, and there's you, and you perceive it. End of discussion. Time for the beach. Okay, we could just close up shop right there. Now, of course, the awareness is produced by an active process. It's an extremely delicate and complex process that's performed by the nervous system. But philosophers have no business speculating from their armchairs about how the nervous system does this. That's a scientific issue. Second, perception is automatic. Right? It's the inexorable effect of a causal interaction between the environment and the nervous system. So we have no choices to make. Once you open your eyes, what you see is determined by the way your visual system responds to the light. Right? So in perception, we don't need any guidelines or standards. We don't have to be taught how to do it. If you're sitting in your living room and you observe a water stain on the ceiling and you're wondering where it came from, well, then logic can help you. It will tell you that since water runs downhill, you might begin your investigation upstairs. But if you're having trouble seeing the water stain, then logic isn't going to help you. What you need is a doctor. Finally, because perception is direct and automatic, there's no further question of validation. Perception is the foundation of knowledge. It's the source of everything that we know. So any attempt to validate it in terms of other knowledge would be circular. And as we saw last time in talking about the primacy of existence, perception doesn't need to be validated in that way. Its validity is self-evident. Okay, well, for all these reasons, it may seem that epistemologists can take perception pretty much for granted, and that a book called The Evidence of the Senses, written by an epistemologist, would be a pretty slim volume, which, by the way, it isn't. So why is there such a field as the epistemology of perception? Well, the answer lies in the connections between perception and all the rest of our knowledge. If we were restricted to the perceptual level, as the animals are, then we would indeed have no need for epistemology, even if by some cognitive miracle we were capable of discussing epistemology without concepts. But because perception is the foundation for the whole structure of conceptual knowledge, there are two kinds of issues that epistemology has to consider about perception. First of all, the validity of all our knowledge rests on the validity of perception. We've seen there's no fundamental question whether perception is valid, but there are a host of specific phenomena, such as optical illusions, that skeptics have used to challenge the reliability of the senses. Okay? All of these challenges can be answered by distinguishing between what we perceive and how we perceive. okay, by introducing the distinction between the object of awareness and the form in which we're aware of it. Okay. Those are distinctions that I mentioned in my last lecture, but we need to understand in more detail how they apply to the actual phenomena. And that's the subject I'm going to talk about in the first part of the lecture, part 1. Secondly, all of our knowledge is based on the integration of perceptual data. For example, forming concepts. Now, this integration is a conscious process, so epistemology has to study the integration of perceptual data. But in order to understand the integration, we have to understand the nature of the data that are being integrated. So in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about one of the issues that fall under that heading, namely, that perception is the awareness of entities. Unlike a fleeting sensation, perception is the discrimination of an object as a unitary whole, having a specific identity and enduring over time. So in the second part of the lecture, we'll examine the distinction between sensation and perception. Now, I should say that we're going to be moving at a somewhat more concrete level today than we did on Monday. We'll be looking at some actual features of experiences, perceptual experiences that we all have in common. We'll even be doing 1 or 2 simple experiments. I'm going to ask you to indulge me in a few of these. They won't be very complex. You can get an idea of their complexity from the experimental apparatus that I have here. I should also say that we're going to be dealing with a somewhat narrower range of issues, or rather issues of a somewhat narrower interest. The level we were talking on last Monday was the level of broad philosophical fundamentals in epistemology, and that's the level at which epistemology affects areas outside philosophy, such as journalism or education, to mention 2 that have come up in the last few days. These topics about perception tend to be of somewhat narrower interest to philosophers, to epistemologists. However, I want to make a case to you for paying some attention to them. First, because while all you really need, in a sense, is the basic distinction between what we perceive and how we perceive, in order, and correspondingly between the object of perception and the form of perception, in order to possess those concepts, you need to see how to apply them in some concrete cases. Okay, and that's what we're going to do today. Secondly, while the fundamental level of epistemology is the one that affects the broader political and cultural trends, you have to understand that some of these narrower issues are the ones that lead philosophers to one or the other side of the basic issues, primacy of existence versus primacy of consciousness. And that, of course, affects the kind of culture and political system that we live in. If we are dissatisfied by the fact that we are now living in a culture that no longer, a political system that no longer recognizes John Locke's principles of individual rights, the reason is in part because of Kant and his espousal of the primacy of consciousness, but that followed in turn from the inability of philosophers, and John Locke was preeminent among them, the failure of those philosophers to deal with some of the puzzles and problems of perception. Okay, let's then get started. Part 1, form and object. The operation of our senses can affect the way things appear to us, the way they look, sound, feel, taste, and smell. You're all familiar with many, many examples of this. When you go out into the sunlight, you experience intense and often uncomfortable brightness. But gradually your eyes adapt, and things seem less bright than at first, even though there's been no change in the objective intensity of the light. Okay? You will experience that in about an hour and a quarter. But same way, when you come inside, things seem unusually dim until your eyes adjust to that level of illumination. You probably had that experience a few minutes ago. Or again, let's look at my little experimental apparatus here. If you look at this, what you see is a circle. This is very close to being a perfect circle because I drew it with a little string, and so if Euclid is right, this is a perfect circle. Those of you, however, who are sitting to one or the other side of this, if you focus on this as an item in your visual field, if you disregard the various cues that tell you that you're looking at it at a slant, and just focus at it the way an artist would, what you will see is something that looks like an ellipse. Okay? Those of you in the center will be seeing it in a more circular form. But if I now tilt it, okay, even those of you in the center will be able to see this as, it will look somewhat like an ellipse. Okay, unless you can project your astral body about 20 feet in the air, no one in this room now can see this as a circle. Although you can see that it is a circle. I'm not denying that, but it will look somewhat like an ellipse. Okay, and of course, as you moved and changed your position, the contours of the ellipse would, or the shape of the ellipse would somewhat change. Okay, these are examples of what philosophers call the relativity of perception. Okay, and I'm here talking about the facts of perceptual relativity. This relativity is not limited to vision. When a car passes you with its horn blaring, it often sounds as if the pitch of the horn is changing, even though the vibrator is going at the same rate. If you've just had pancakes with syrup, milk will taste sour. I include that because that was my first experience of perceptual relativity as a kid. If you've just been washing dishes in hot water, then warm water will feel cool on your hands. Perceptual relativity occurs in every sense modality and with regard to every attribute of objects that we can perceive through any of the sense modalities. The relativity consists in the fact that the same identical object may appear differently in different circumstances. Two people looking at the same identical object may see it differently, or the same person may see it differently at different times. Now, the cases I've mentioned so far have been everyday, familiar types of perceptual relativity. There are also more radical cases that are known as illusions. For example, and this is the classical example, a stick that is half submerged in water will look bent, even though, in fact, it's straight. Or you can take a flat disk of white paper, paint a certain design on the surface using only black, and then if you spin it at the right rate, you will see colors. This is called a Benham disk, and for those of you who are going into San Diego on your free day, you'll find one at the Science Museum in Balboa Park, along with a number of other optical illusions. Now, there's no mystery why perceptual relativity occurs. The appearance of an object is the result of a causal interaction between the object and our sense faculties. In the case of vision and hearing, there's also a medium, light and the sound waves. The outcome of that interaction is determined by all three participants, the object, the medium, and the sensory systems. So even if the object doesn't change, changes in the other elements can alter the appearance. No mystery. And scientists, in fact, know a fair amount about how that works in specific cases. For example, the bent look of the stick, as I'm sure you know, results from the optical phenomenon of refraction. Or again, when you come in out of the sunlight and the room looks dimmer than usual, the reason is that when you were outside, your visual receptors were firing extremely rapidly. That depleted a visual pigment called rhodopsin. And so, which rhodopsin is, in a sense, the fuel that receptors use when they fire in your visual receptors. And so when you came inside, you had a lower level of rhodopsin, and your senses couldn't respond adequately to the new lower level of illumination. Now, of course, I'm oversimplifying like crazy, and there are some phenomena for which scientists haven't yet found the exact causal basis. But it's clear in principle that these phenomena result from the interaction between our senses and the environment. There's no mystery about why they occur. However, the fact that they occur has seemed to most philosophers incompatible with the validity of perception. And to express this felt contradiction that most philosophers have seen between the facts of perceptual relativity and the validity of perception, I'm going to present to you a classical argument which is called the argument from perceptual relativity, an ancient argument that goes back to the Greeks. It goes like this. How can we see the object as it really is if our perception of it is affected by factors that are extraneous to the object? If a thing's appearance is affected by the nature of our own sensory systems, then it doesn't appear to us the way it really is. There's a gulf between appearance and reality. So what we perceive is only the appearance, not the real external object. Well, now let's take this a step further. If we don't perceive the external object, according to this argument, then what do we perceive? Well, we perceive an internal object. Philosophers who accept this argument, the argument from perceptual relativity, are known as representationalists. It's a mouthful, but there's no simpler way to express it or better way to express it. They are representationalists. They hold that an appearance is a subjective state. An appearance is an effect of the object on our consciousness. This subjective state, they say, exists in consciousness. It's a kind of mental image. So when you look at this circle, what you're seeing, in fact, especially if it's, to make it clear, we'll tilt it, what you're seeing is really an elliptical appearance, not an actual physical circle. Okay? And this image has the same status as the images in a dream or an hallucination. Okay? The image represents the external object in the way that a portrait represents a person. That's where the name comes from. But a portrait is a distinct object from the person who's represented in that portrait. And so if you're looking at a portrait, you're not literally seeing the person. In the same way, representationalists say, we do not literally see the external object, we only see an image that is a distinct entity from that external object. The mind, according to representationalists, is a kind of inner theater, a kind of inner movie house where we watch images that play across an inner screen. Okay? We have no direct contact with reality outside. Our only contact is that the images may correspond to objects in reality. But, on the other hand, they may not. Implicit in this view, in representationalism, is the assumption that the mind could have generated all of these images out of itself. Okay? The external world is a possible source of these images, but it's not a necessary source of the images. Consciousness could originate all of its own perceptual contents, as it seems to do in a dream, they say. Now let's step back for a moment and look at what's going on here. First of all, notice that representationalism accepts one of the main tenets of the primacy of consciousness that we talked about last time. It holds that consciousness can originate its own contents independently of reality. Consciousness is metaphysically active. But the representationalists do not accept the other main tenet of the primacy of consciousness. They don't think that the objects, the ultimate objects of knowledge, depend on the subject. They think there is a real world out there, independent of us. It's just that consciousness is not inherently dependent on that world for its contents. So representationalism, in effect, is an attempt to split the difference between the primacy of existence and the primacy of consciousness. Okay? Let me give you an analogy. Just as liberals in foreign policy think that neither the US nor the Soviet Union should have military superiority, representationalists think that neither consciousness nor existence is primary. They think that existence and consciousness are two separate but autonomous realms that exist in a kind of metaphysical détente. Now, you may recall that on Monday, I gave the same analysis of skepticism that I just gave you for representationalism as a kind of middle position. The skeptic believes that consciousness could originate all of its own contents, as we saw, and to that extent, he holds the primacy of consciousness. But the skeptic holds that, not exactly that there is a world out there, but that consciousness to be valid would have to be capable of grasping such a world. So the skeptic accepts the primacy of consciousness view that the mind is active, but he also holds the realist, the primacy of existence standard for validity. Okay, so the only difference between skeptics and representationalists is that representationalists think we can have knowledge of the external world, even though we don't directly perceive objects in that world. We can infer the existence of such objects from their effects on our consciousness. Okay? Whereas skeptics feel that such inferences are always unsound, they're never valid, and that the existence of any objects outside the mind is always going to be in doubt. So the skeptic, in effect, is a representationalist who's having an anxiety attack. Okay? Now, this anxiety is quite well deserved. It's very appropriate. If it were true that we're trapped in an inner theater, directly aware only of images that our consciousness itself originated, then there would indeed be no ground for inferring the existence of external objects. So the representationalism that was maintained by philosophers such as René Descartes and, I'm sorry to say, John Locke in the 17th century, that representationalism led to the skepticism of David Hume a century later in the 18th century, and that in turn, as we saw, led to the full-blown idealism of Immanuel Kant. So you really can't split the difference between the primacy of existence and the primacy of consciousness. Once you step off the shore of realism, so to speak, you're going to be sucked out to sea. Ultimately, you'll be drawn into representationalism, and the skeptics will then eat at you until you have an anxiety attack, and then you'll be blown all the way out. Okay? On the other hand, though, there's no basis for skepticism until we have adopted the representationalist position. Okay? Without representationalism, the skeptical arguments can't even get off the ground, because from a realist point of view, if we're directly aware of external objects, we don't have to infer their existence. We're directly aware of them. Their existence is self-evident. Okay, so it matters a good deal. Traditional argument for representationalism, which is this argument from perceptual relativity, has been an important basis for anti-realism. Let's look at that argument. The argument says that to perceive an object as it is, our perceptual faculties cannot affect the way the object appears. The angle of observation must not affect the apparent shape of the object. So a circle must occupy a circular portion of our visual field no matter where we're standing, if consciousness is going to be valid. The rhodopsin level in our visual receptors must not affect the apparent brightness of the illumination. This is what the argument is saying. The prior state of adaptation of our temperature receptors may not affect the experience of warmth and coolness. Now, isn't this impossible, you may ask? Is it not, in effect, a demand that consciousness violate the laws of physics and biology? Would it not, in fact, violate the law of identity by demanding that the faculty of consciousness produce an effect that doesn't depend on the nature of consciousness? Yes, says the argument, all these consequences follow. If consciousness cannot meet this standard, well, then so much the worse for consciousness. You can see, therefore, that this argument incorporates the diaphanous model of awareness that I talked about last time. It assumes that we can perceive objects and their attributes only if perception is a form of revelation, a state of awareness that is not produced by any specific means. It assumes that if a faculty of perceptual awareness has any identity, then it cannot grasp the identities of objects outside of it. The argument then goes on to say that our perceptual faculties do have an identity. They do interact with objects in specific ways, and this interaction does affect the way objects appear. Therefore, we don't really perceive those objects outside the mind, but only their effects on our consciousness. So in this respect, a representationalist is a kind of frustrated, naive realist. As soon as he realizes that he can't have a diaphanous view of external objects, he kind of invents an inner realm of inner objects that he thinks he can be diaphanously aware of. But we know from last time that the diaphanous model is false. That whole picture of how the mind works is false. So we can dispense with the argument from perceptual relativity. But of course we can't dispense with the facts of perceptual relativity because they are facts. We still need to see how to interpret those facts properly. And let's now turn to the objectivist theory. The first step is to recognize that an object's appearance is not an entity. It's not a thing distinct from the object. The concept of appearance designates a relationship between the object and the perceiver. Okay? Now look at this sheet of paper here. Okay? The fact that the paper appears to you, that it looks a certain way to you, and the fact that you're aware of the paper, those are the same fact. The concept of appearance and the concept of awareness, or consciousness in this case, describe the same relationship between you and the paper. The only difference, if I can speak like a linguistic analyst for a moment, the only difference is that the two concepts describe this relationship between you and the paper from opposite ends, so to speak. We say that you are aware of the paper, but we say that the paper appears to you. Same relationship, just looking at it from the two different ends. So the statement that we perceive appearances That's a hopeless confusion. It's equivalent to saying we perceive our perception. That's nonsense. Secondly, certain aspects of the object's appearance depend on the nature of your sense organs and the way they interact with the object and the medium. Okay, look at the circle again. Let me tilt it a bit for the full effect. If you focus on it as an item in your visual field, if you focus on it in the way that an artist would, you'll notice that the surface does look like an ellipse in a certain respect. It's not that you're actually seeing an ellipse. There's no ellipse here. There's a circle. There's no actual ellipse anywhere in this room, at least not that I'm aware of. But the circle, in a certain respect, does look the way an actual ellipse would look if it were in a plane perpendicular to your line of sight. Okay? This aspect of the circle's appearance, okay, the respect in which it looks like an ellipse, depends on the way your visual system works. It depends on the fact that an object in three-dimensional space is being projected onto a two-dimensional retina in your eye. To designate any such aspect of an object's appearance, objectivism uses the concept of form. A form is an aspect of an object's appearance that depends on the way our senses respond to that object in the conditions at hand. So when I drew your attention to the apparent shape of the circle in your visual field, I was drawing your attention to the form in which you perceive its real shape. Okay, let me give you the definition of form again. This is important. A form is an aspect of an object's appearance that depends on the way our senses respond to that object in the conditions at hand. A form is an aspect of an object's appearance that depends on the way our senses respond to that object in the conditions at hand. I'm not sure I'd want to be held to that as a definition, but well, we can pursue that more in the question period. Okay? So the elliptical appearance of that circle is an aspect of the form. When you buy a tie or a scarf inside a store and then take it outside and it looks different in the sunlight from the way it looked in the store, what's happening is that the difference in illumination is causing you to perceive its color in a different form. Okay? In general, because we perceive every attribute of an object by some specific process, we perceive every attribute in some specific form. Now, this is the essential point to remember. A form is an aspect of appearance that can vary with variations in the means of perception. It's an aspect of appearance that can vary even if the object is unchanging, but only the state of the medium or your own sensory systems are changing. Okay, so that's our test for whether something is part of the form of perception. Okay? So the form is a consequence at the level of conscious experience of the physiological fact that our senses operate in a definite physical way. Okay, now there's a great deal we could say about the form of perception. I know this because I have said a great deal about it elsewhere. But for our purposes, I want to limit myself to 4 main points. First, the form is not an image or a copy of the object. The form is not an entity in its own right, distinct from the object. A form is an aspect of an object's appearance. That's what I've just been saying. Without the object, there's no appearance, and without the appearance, there are no aspects of appearance. We don't perceive the form as distinct from the object. We perceive an object in a form. Okay, when you look at the circle, the patch in your visual field that looks like an ellipse, that's not an image or a veil that stands between you and the real circle. It is the circle. The patch in your visual field is this very circle as seen by you from there. Secondly, the form is not in your mind, contrary to representationalism. It is not subjective. Why not? Well, it's a product of an interaction between the object and the senses. Therefore, to be sure, it's not in the object as an intrinsic property. Okay? This is not literally elliptical. But it's not in your senses either, nor is it in consciousness, nor is it anywhere in between. Precisely because it's a product of an interaction, it cannot be located in any of the things that interact. And let me give you an analogy. Imagine two cars have a violent collision, and then someone comes along and says, well, there's violence here. I wonder which car was violent, the Ford or the Buick. Well, that's absurd. It's the collision that's violent. It's the interaction that's violent, not any one of the things that interact. And the same is true for the form of perception. The form is an aspect of the way we interact with the object. If you want to know what the form, what the form is a property of something, what is it a property of? It's a property of the object as perceived by us. Okay. Third, notice that because the form depends on the way our senses respond to an object, it's possible to perceive the same object in different forms. Okay. You can see this in a simple case whenever the conditions of perception change. If you walked around the room, the form in which you perceive this circle would alter as you moved. Let's look at a slightly more interesting case. Suppose our sense organs were different. We didn't just change the conditions of perception, but we actually altered our sense organs. Imagine, for example, I'll give you an actual example. When we look at an object, okay, such as a pen, which I don't have here, I have my lighter. Okay, I can look at this lighter and see that it's roughly kind of a squashed cylinder and kind of long. I can see that. And I see it in a visual form that consists of colors and a certain shape in the visual field, etc. I can also feel the shape of it in my hand, even if I'm not looking at it. In this case, I'm still perceiving the shape. I can still tell what shape it is. But I'm perceiving that in the quite different form of a whole set of tactual sensations. There's no colors in my hands. Okay. Let's finally consider one example even further out. As I'm sure you all know, bats perceive objects by means of echoes and echolocation. Their auditory system is so highly developed that they can detect the size and the shape of objects, and even in some cases the texture of an object, by means of hearing, okay, by the way they reflect sounds. Bats literally hear the size, the shape, and even the texture of objects. Now, we have no idea, at least I have no idea, what it would be like to experience objects in that form. But what they perceive, those properties of shape, size, and texture, those are the same properties that we can perceive by means of vision and touch. Okay. Fourth, and finally, there can be no such thing as a false or invalid perception. Okay. This is a crucial point. A false perception would have to mean perceiving an object in the wrong form. But there's no such thing as the wrong form to perceive an object in. Why not? Well, the form is a causal product of a physical interaction among the object, the medium, and the sense organs. Okay? In any given set of circumstances, there's only one form that can be produced by that interaction, and that form faithfully reflects all the factors that are operating. Okay? So long as a form allows us to discriminate an object, or to discriminate a given attribute, so long as that's possible, then it is a form in which we perceive that object or that attribute. Remember that we've rejected the diaphanous model of perception. That means there's no right way for an object to appear apart from its interaction with sense organs of a particular type. Okay? You can't step out from behind your mind, kind of put your mind there and look out at reality to see and then say, oh, that's how objects really look. Gee, they don't look that way from behind my eyes. That would be a contradiction. If you step out from behind your senses, objects don't look any way at all because you can't obviously perceive them. Okay, now, there are illusions. There are such things as the bent stick or the Benham disc, etc. But these are not perceptual phenomena. What's illusory about the bent stick is not its appearance per se, but the fact that we're likely to make the wrong judgment about it. Mm-hmm. We're likely to misidentify it conceptually. We'll assimilate it to the concept bent instead of the concept straight. In and of itself, the appearance is not false or illusory. It's the only possible form in which we could perceive the stick, given that the light it reflects is being refracted. The problem is that that's an unusual circumstance in which to perceive an object, and therefore we're perceiving it in an unusual form, and our concepts for perceptual properties are tied to the usual forms in which we perceive them. Okay? So the error here occurs at the conceptual level. In effect, we're assuming that conditions are normal when they're not. I mean, if you judge that the stick is bent. So in summary, a form of perception is not an entity, and it's not in the mind. Those are the first 2 points. The same object can be perceived in different forms, point 3, and there are no wrong or illusory forms, just mistaken judgments, point 4. Okay? Now, let's apply the concept of form to one last issue, the issue of sensory qualities. The examples of perceptual relativity that I've talked about so far are familiar everyday phenomena. But the concept of form is not restricted to these phenomena, to these cases. It's an open-ended concept that we use to identify any sort of relativity as we acquire evidence for it. Okay? Now, common sense gives us all the evidence we need about the familiar cases, but there are other deeper levels of relativity that have been discovered by science. And I want to look at this deeper level, which involves sensory qualities. We all know that an object's particular shade of color seems to vary with changes in the illumination. I mentioned earlier the example of the scarf. That looks different in daylight from the way it looked in the store. If the scarf is red, say, the exact shade of red varies with the conditions of perception, with the nature of the illumination. And this changing shade of red pertains to the form in which we perceive the color. But science tells us that the very color itself, the very quality red, okay, not just the exact shade, but red as such, the quality that we describe as a warm color, that quality also depends on our perceptual apparatus. It isn't out there in the objects, apart from us. Our experience of that red color is a response by our visual system to light of a certain wavelength. And a physical object reflects light of that wavelength essentially because of the atomic structure of its surface, of the atoms in its surface. Okay. So red is not an intrinsic property of the object itself. It's a product of the interaction between the object with its atomic structure and the surface, the light it reflects, and the way our eyes respond to that light. Okay. So red is the form in which we perceive. Well, in which we perceive what? Well, the property of the object to which our senses, in fact, are responding is the atomic structure of its surface. That's why it's reflecting the light. So red is the form in which we perceive that atomic structure. Okay. Now, the same is true for other sensory qualities in the other sense modalities. Warmth and coolness, for example, don't exist in objects outside of us, not felt warmth and coolness. Sensations of warmth and coolness are the form in which we perceive the kinetic energy of molecules in the surface of the object that we touch with our hands. That molecular energy level is what's intrinsically in the object. That's what a thermometer measures, and that's what our touch receptors are responding to when we feel warmth and coolness. Sweetness and other sensory qualities of taste and smell are the forms in which we perceive certain chemical properties of substances. And in the case of hearing, I'm sure you've all heard the old conundrum, if a tree falls in the forest when no one is there, does it make a sound? Well, we can now answer that question. If by sound we mean a certain pattern of vibrations in the air, well then of course, yes, that does occur. The tree makes that pattern of vibrations in the air. But if we mean the roaring, whooshing noise that has a certain sensory pitch and loudness, well then no, that's not there. That's the form in which a perceiver, if one were present, would respond to and perceive the pattern of air vibrations. So this is a more radical kind of relativity. Okay? It's not, and I want to emphasize that the reason for accepting it as a fact of relativity is purely scientific. Okay, this is not a philosophical issue, it's a scientific one. Nevertheless, the concept of form applies to this level, and everything I said before about the forms of perception is true for colors, tastes, and other sensory qualities. Okay? A person whose visual system were wired up differently from ours, for example, might perceive objects in the form of different colors. What we see as green, he might see as red. Such a person would still be perceiving the same surface properties that we do. He would classify them in the same way on the basis of their similarities. And he would learn to measure them as we do in terms of the wavelengths of light. It's just that he'd perceive those surface properties in a different form. And you know, to a certain extent, this is what happens in certain forms of color blindness. People with certain types of color blindness can discriminate the differences among objects pretty much in the same way we do, okay, though they're experiencing them in a different form. It's just that, well, for example, a child, it often happens that a colorblind child will grow up and be able to discriminate the different colors. He'll learn to call a tomato red, grass green, milk white, and so on. In other words, he learns to classify objects under the color concepts that his parents are teaching him and using the color words that they're using him. And neither he nor anyone else knows that he's experiencing them in a somewhat different form until he's given more sophisticated tests by optometrists. Okay. Also, because color is the product of an interaction between the object and our sensory systems, the question, where is red, is not a valid one. Color is not in the mind, it's not in consciousness. Consciousness is not red, but it's not in the object either. It's as a product of an interaction, as I said before, it can't be located in that sense. Okay. Finally, let me end this part of the lecture by considering briefly two objections, the two objections that in my experience have been raised most often against this view of sensory qualities. Objection number one. How can I say that we actually perceive atomic structure? Come on, my students say. What we see just doesn't look like an atomic structure. Okay? But then I would have to ask in reply, what is an atomic structure supposed to look like? Okay? We all have a picture in our minds that we got from our physics textbooks or from Scientific American or from Time magazine for that matter. A picture of atomic structure is a kind of swirl of little gray particles. Atomic structure might look that way to atomic-sized perceivers. That would be merely another way that a certain attribute could appear to perceivers with certain types of sense organs. And their philosophers, the atomic-sized philosophers, would ask the same questions we do. Where's the gray? How can we see the real shape of atoms if the apparent shape depends on our angle of vision? They'd be perceiving in a form just the way we are. It's just a different form. Okay? Obviously, this objection isn't an attempt to step out from behind our senses to see what atomic structure looks like diaphanously, okay, without affecting anyone's sense organs. And of course, that's a contradiction. A thing cannot look any way without appearing in a certain way to a certain perceiver. Color is the way atomic structure appears to perceivers like us. Okay, objection number two. Colors, this is the objection. Colors are not intrinsic properties of objects. They're relational qualities that result from an interaction. Okay, that's what we've been saying. But that's not how we perceive them, says the argument, says the objection. We experience a color as external to the mind. Okay? What I've been telling you about colors should come as a surprise if you haven't heard it before, because to us, colors look as if they're out there in the objects, in the surface of the objects, as intrinsic properties of that surface. Okay? And that again is true. Well, so goes the objection. Isn't that a kind of illusion? Philosophy tells us that color is not intrinsic in the object. Our senses tell us that color is out there intrinsic in the object. So aren't our senses deceiving us? Okay? Now, I think if we can answer this question, we can pride ourselves on thoroughly understanding the concept of form. To answer the question, to the objection, let's take the concept of deception literally. Let's ask what would have to be the case for our senses to be convicted of deceiving us. They would have to tell us something that isn't true. All right, what's the truth here? The truth is that there are two properties. There's the atomic structure of the surface, and there's the sensory quality red. The atomic structure, as distinct from the sensory quality, is an intrinsic property of the surface. It's in the surface. The sensory quality, as distinct from the atomic structure, is not intrinsic to the surface. It's a relational property that depends on the perceiver. But that distinction between the two qualities can be drawn only at the conceptual level, only on the basis of scientific knowledge. It cannot be drawn at the perceptual level. I don't see two separate properties, the atomic structure and the sensory quality red. For me to do that, each would have to appear to me in a certain form, but color is the form in which the atomic structure is appearing to me. So you can't ask the senses to perform the function of the conceptual level. So, when I experience the red color as external to my mind, as a property of the surface, my senses are not telling me that the red as distinct from the atomic structure is intrinsic to the surface. That would be a kind of deception. What my senses are saying is some property that I experience in the form red is an intrinsic property of the surface. That's what it means to experience the red as being in the surface. It means something that I'm perceiving in the form red is an intrinsic property of the surface. And that's true. My eyes do not deceive me, because I am experiencing something, namely the atomic structure, that is intrinsic to that surface. Experiencing the red as external to my mind is the only way that I could perceive the externality of the atomic structure. So given the fact that I have to perceive, that we have to perceive in specific means, and therefore in a specific form, we perceive color as being in exactly the right place, the place of the object, of the attribute that we're discriminating by means of color. All right, I know that was pretty fast and furious. I'll be happy to answer questions about it in the question period. But to conclude this part of the lecture, because we are running out of time, once we've grasped the concept of form, and once we've thoroughly rejected the diaphanous model, we can see that the facts of perceptual relativity do not pose any threat to the validity of perception, the reliability of the senses. Which brings us to part 2. I want to change gears now and take up the separate topic, the distinction between sensation and perception. Now, as I mentioned at the outset of the lecture, this is a very important distinction in epistemology, because it makes a big difference in ways that I'm going to explain later. It makes a big difference which of these two levels of awareness represents the given, which of them represents the foundations of knowledge. To put it in what the importance is in a word at the outset, if the level of sensations were the given, we would not be able to reach the conceptual level, okay? Which would be a fairly large deficit in our cognitive life. Okay, so let's talk about sensations and perceptions. 3 centuries ago, a man named William Molyneux wrote to the philosopher John Locke with an interesting question. Suppose, he said, that a man who had been blind from birth had grown up, had learned to find his way around in the world, had learned how to speak, and then his sight were restored to him by some operation. Would he see the world the way we do? If he were shown an object that he was familiar with by touch, could he identify it just by looking? Would he even see objects as such? Well, there is in fact an operation that can restore sight in certain types of blindness, where a lens has been clouded or occluded. And so Molyneux's question can be answered experimentally. As it happens, however, there's no single answer. Some patients have a lot less difficulty than others in learning how to use their new sensory capacity. But a large number have tremendous difficulty. And their first experience of sight after the operation is radically different from our own experience of sight. They do not see objects as such. What they see are vague patches of color. They don't see depth. They see the color patches as lying in a two-dimensional plane before their eyes. Except, even that is too definite a description, because they don't experience that two-dimensional plane as having any definite distance from them. It just kind of floats somewhere in an indeterminate way. One doctor described it this way: they see colors much as we smell an odor of peat or varnish, which enfolds and intrudes upon us. Imagine seeing the world in that form. They can see the differences between the colors, but apparently most of them cannot focus on the shapes or sizes of the color patches. When they when an object moves across their visual field, they don't follow the object as a single thing moving. What they see is an interlude of light and then dark and then light, a kind of kaleidoscopic change as the object passes in front of them. Now, this is not the way we see the world. The study of people who have just gained their sight gives us some inkling of what it would be like to experience the world in the form of sensations. But this mode of experience is really quite foreign to us. Our own experience takes the form of perception. I'm using form here not in the technical sense, just in a more general way. We perceive objects. We perceive them as wholes, as unitary existence. We discriminate them as units from the background of other objects. In vision, we see depth, the third dimension, as easily and automatically as we perceive the two other dimensions. We perceive an object as having a definite identity as a unit, an identity that remains the same even as we change our perspective on it. When an object moves, we can follow it over time. So the essential characteristic of perception is that it involves the awareness of things as such. It involves the discrimination of individual, particular things as units from their background. It involves the awareness of entities. Now let's look at this aspect of perception a little more closely. The difference between sensation and perception does not lie in the fact that perception involves discrimination. Okay? In the broadest sense, discrimination means differentiation, that is, the awareness of difference. And that is present at every level of cognition, from sensation through all of our concepts. Even at the level of sensation, there has to be some contrast present. There's a famous experiment in which they tried to present a subject with a completely undifferentiated visual field. The one I'm familiar with, they took a ping pong ball, cut it in half, put the two halves over the eyes, and then put the subject in a room where there was just diffuse green light with no changes in the intensity of the light. As a result, the subjects reported that they experienced an undifferentiated spread of green. Okay, no patterns, no borders, just this purely green fog. That's what their visual field consisted of. Okay, well, of course, at first they had sensations of green, but these gradually faded, and they were replaced by what's called brain gray, which is the physiologist term for the experience we have in the dark with our eyes adapted. When you're lying awake at night and you can't get to sleep, and your eyes are closed, you're experiencing brain gray. It's not pure black, but it's just a few random firings. It's the absence of visual experience, in effect. That's what happened to these subjects, even though the light falling on their eyes was quite intense. So, even a simple sensation requires some kind of contrast, some discrimination, some awareness of difference. Okay? So the difference between sensation and perception doesn't lie in discrimination per se. It lies in what is discriminated. Sensation is the awareness of individual qualities as more or less self-contained units. Qualities as self-contained units, whereas perception is the awareness of entities, objects possessing a unified nature that includes and embraces all of their qualities. So we have sensations of red or sweet or middle C, but we perceive an object, a chunk of food, or a sound. Okay? Okay, well, this is not a definition. This one, for sure, is not a definition, but it's a description. A sensation would be the awareness of an individual quality, an isolated quality, whereas perception involves the awareness of a whole thing, which, of course, has many qualities, and we perceive those qualities as going together. Okay. For example, and I think this will spell it out a little further. In psychology, the Gestalt school, despite its other faults, the Gestalt school, I think, identified this aspect of perception clearly, although their explanation wasn't too hot. They pointed out that the perceptual field is segmented. We don't experience a welter of unrelated qualities. That would be sensations. No. We experience the qualities as going together, as belonging together in certain groups, they said. Now, there's some truth to that way of putting it. Now, if you look at a person, you do see, in a sense, there are various patches of color there, the clothing, the face, the hair. You don't experience those as distinct objects, distinct entities. They're all parts of the same entity. The border between a person's hair and the background is a contour between one entity and other entities. But the contour between a person's, say, face and his shirt, one you can all see, is not experienced as a contour between two different entities. Okay? We can also take a negative example to see what's a case where the contours are not visible. Okay? Imagine a soldier wearing camouflage fatigues is standing at the edge of the woods. Okay? Now, if the camouflage works, the borders between the patches of color on his fatigues are more prominent than the border between him and the woods. Okay? That means you don't perceive the soldier as such, even if you can see every part of his facing surface. The whole point of camouflage is to throw off our perceptual faculty. At the level of sensations, camouflage would be pointless, because there would be nothing to disguise. We wouldn't see the soldier anyway. We'd always see as the patches of color. He could be wearing Dayglow blue, and all we would see is a patch of Dayglow blue. Now, in vision, this aspect of perception is called the figure-ground phenomenon. It's a term some of you may have heard. We discriminate a figure as a whole from its background. But the other sense modalities work the same way. In hearing, for example, there's a so-called cocktail party phenomenon. You're standing in the midst of a bunch of people, all of them are babbling away, and all those voices are arriving at your ear as a single complicated wave train, but your auditory system allows you to pick out one of those wave trains, the voice of a single person, and listen to it as a unit. Okay? So even though that voice is not literally an entity, you're perceiving it as a unified whole. Okay? And remember, it's not just qualities within a single sense modality that we group together perceptually. When you hear the telephone ring, you turn to look at it, and you reach out to pick up the receiver. You experience it as a single object that you hear, see, and touch. Okay? Or when you eat a candy bar, you perceive the flavor by taste, and the odor by smell, and the texture of it by touch receptors. But you don't experience them as isolated qualities. You experience them as they're aspects of a single, unified, delectable whole, and a total experience. However, it's dangerous to describe this as the Gestalt psychologists did, to say that what we're doing is grouping together qualities, because that suggests that the groupings maybe are kind of loose and they're kind of arbitrary. It presupposes, in the way it's formulated, that we start with the awareness of qualities and then put them together. But that's not what happens. We start out with the awareness of entities as unified wholes, and then we can focus selectively on individual qualities. Okay? At the perceptual level, entities are the primary objects, and the awareness of their particular qualities comes later. It's a derivative ability. Okay? Moreover, even when we do focus selectively on a single quality in perception, such as color or shape of an object, we don't experience it as a self-contained unit. We perceive it as the color or shape of a particular entity. Okay? We perceive the quality as belonging to a certain entity, even if we're not paying much attention to the entity. Okay, now this is a subtle point, but it's an important one. When Aristotle laid out his basic categories, the basic kind of existence that there are, such as entities, actions, attributes, relationships, Aristotle pointed out that entities are the basic existence. An attribute is always an attribute of an entity. An action is always performed by some entity. A relationship is always a relationship among entities, and so on. Okay? Well, my point now is that this fact is available to us in perception. We are aware of qualities as qualities of entities. We perceive them that way. For example, let's take the figure-ground phenomenon. The figure is distinguished from the ground by means of some contour. This line here is the upper edge of the podium. It's the contour that separates the podium as a figure from its background, namely me. Now, if you were functioning at the level of sensations, you might experience this line here, okay, merely as a border between two patches of color. You might experience this line as belonging equally to this patch of color and to this patch of color. But at least I hope that's not how you perceive it. Okay? You perceive the line as an attribute of the podium, not as an attribute of me. You perceive it as a contour where the podium stops, as an edge where the podium stops, not as an edge where I stop. Okay? Thank God. Okay? So in that sense, we perceive the attribute as an attribute of an entity. Okay. Finally, the awareness of entities means the awareness of objects that persist and retain their identities over time. Okay. A sensation is a momentary experience. At the level of sensation, every moment is a new experience, replacing the one before and replaced in turn by the one that comes after. But an entity is not a momentary existent. You couldn't have the experience of entities in a moment. It requires integration over time. Okay, so when a baseball player, as you will observe next week, when a baseball player runs to catch a fly ball, he sees it as a single object that is moving and changing its position relative to him, not as a kaleidoscopic change in his visual field, and not as a series of individual frames as in a slow-moving animated cartoon. Okay, to put all this in a nutshell, perception is the awareness of things. Things that possess various attributes and relationships and that move and change in time while maintaining their identities. Okay? Perception tells us not just that something exists, as we saw last time, but that entities exist. Now, this is a crucial fact in epistemology because all the rest of our knowledge depends on it. When we form concepts, for example, we do so on the basis of their perceived similarities. But similarity is a relationship among entities. When we explore those similarities, we distinguish the attributes that entities have in common from the attributes that distinguish them. Okay? So we couldn't begin to form concepts unless we could perceive entities as such. You couldn't get to the conceptual level if you had to start with sensations as your epistemological given. Again, a lot of our knowledge is concerned with causality, but causality is a relationship between a thing and the way it acts. If we didn't see things as such, we couldn't form the concept of causality. So perception is a distinct and a crucially important level of cognition. It stands between sensations on the one hand and conceptual knowledge on the other. Now, our conceptual knowledge derives from perceptions by means of a conscious process of integration. Does perception in turn derive from sensations by means of a conscious process of integration? Okay? No. Perception is the basic level of cognition. Perception is the given. Now this is a crucial point, as I've said, and I want to wrap up our discussion by trying to emphasize what the issue is here. At one time, most psychologists believed that infants start out at the level of sensations. Okay? The experience of blind people who gained their sight later in life was taken as an indication of what the world would look like to an infant who just opened his eyes. Okay? In a famous passage that you may have heard before, William James described the experience of the infant as a blooming, buzzing confusion. Okay? Now, more recently, a number of psychologists have found evidence that, at least I think, indicates that we begin our lives already at the perceptual level. Okay? And that perceptual learning involves fine-tuning a set of abilities at the perceptual level, not of putting sensations together. Okay, for example, newborn infants perceive depth in their visual fields. Okay, there have been a number of different kinds of experiments that test that, and they've convinced me anyway. When newborn infants smell an odor or hear a sound, at least according to some experimenters, they can tell, although not with much accuracy, what direction that smell or sound is coming from. That is, they'll turn with their eyes to look at it. Okay? So what they're doing is integrating data from different sense modalities automatically. Okay? They can track an object with their eyes, although it's pretty jerky at first. And they're surprised if an object breaks up and starts moving and the parts start moving in separate directions. Okay? Now, all of these are characteristically perceptual abilities. But regardless of whether we're born with the ability to perceive, or whether it develops later as a result of the maturation of the nervous system, adults are perceivers. We don't experience sensations as such, okay, except perhaps in extremely rare circumstances, or as a result of damage to our nervous systems. For the normal adult, perception is the given. Okay? So the awareness of entities is direct. We do not have to infer that there are entities in the world by putting together sensations or constructing entities out of our sensations by any conscious process. On the contrary, the process by which we perceive is an automatic process of integration that's performed by the brain. Okay, so you can think of the point this way. You could take two subjects, two different perceivers, and present them with the same stimuli, and one would experience sensations and the other would experience perceptions due to differences in the degree of integration their brains were capable of performing on that perceptual data. But a brain that is capable of performing the perceptual level of integration will do it automatically. It's not a conscious process or a consciously directed process. Okay? Well, I was going to give you an example of, just a simple example of, to illustrate what the kind of integration is, but I'm going to put that off to the question period. If there's any unclarity about this point, go ahead and ask me. Okay? This view of perception as the basic level of cognition is contrasted with a view called sensationalism. And unfortunately, sensationalism is the dominant view, has been for a long time, in psychology and also to an extent in philosophy. Sensationalism holds that sensations are the given and that we reach the perceptual level through some kind of process of inference or construction or hypothesizing, calculation, different types of theories, but what they have in common is the notion of a conscious process. Okay, now in my book, The Evidence of the Senses, I examine this whole doctrine in a lot of its different forms, and I can't even begin to summarize that material here. But let me, by way of conclusion, just give you one example of what sensationalism leads to. David Hume, among his other faults, was a sensationalist. He held that the epistemological given consisted of isolated, detached qualities. So he asked, why do we believe that there are entities in the world that possess those qualities as aspects of their identity? Well, Hume denied that we're directly aware of the entities as such. Right? And try as he might, at the level of sensations, he could not find anything else over and above the qualities that he could use as a kind of metaphysical glue to hold the qualities together. All he could find were more qualities. So he concluded that the notion of an entity is a subjective human construct with no basis in experience or reality. Further, because he thought we don't have any basis for believing in entities, he saw no basis for believing that an entity's nature governs its actions. That is, he saw no basis for believing in causality. That, too, he came to regard as a subjective human construct. So this is yet another way in which Hume paved the way for Kant. Hume's sensationalism helped make it possible for Kant to get away with the notion that the world of entities acting according to causal law is a product of consciousness. Okay? And such are the consequences of a mistaken view of perception. Okay, end of part 2, end of lecture, end of this mini course on perception. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sorry that I ran over, but we still have some time for questions. So why don't we start here in the blue? Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
You use the term construct, a subjective construct. How does that differ from a concept?
Well, the question is, I used the term, I said Hume thought that that entities, the notion of entities and of causality were subjective human constructs. How does the notion of a construct differ from the notion of a concept? Construct means it's constructed by us rather than being something in reality that we have identified. Okay? And that's a common usage in philosophy. Right. When you hear the word construct, you should smell a faint odor of Kantianism and explore further. It's a typical Kantian term. Okay? Yes? Susan.
You said that
Yes. Okay, the question is, I said that perception is direct and automatic, and yet I talked about the case where the blind people gain their sight later in life and have a different form of experience from ours. Doesn't that mean that, or indicate perhaps that perception is, after all, learned? Before I answer, I should say that for those of you familiar with the questioner, this was not a planted question. No, I don't think so. The problem is that these are people who have matured, their nervous systems have matured, first of all. They've passed crucial stages in maturation without any visual input at all. And we know physiologically that the optical system in particular does develop. Neural connections are made between cells in the visual part of the brain at crucial stages of maturation during the early years. These people didn't have a chance for that to happen. So gaining their sight as adults puts them in a different position from that of an infant. Secondly, it's likely that there has been some atrophication, that their visual systems have atrophied somewhat as a result of the lack of stimulus. And there may be other kinds of damage also. And one very sad aspect of this is that many of them never do learn how to see. So in that respect, they're clearly unlike infants. They just don't, many of them give up and wish they hadn't had the operation and continue their lives essentially as blind people. Although they simply can't integrate this new experience into their systems. So again, that indicates that they're quite different from infants. Question over here. Is that Genevieve?
Yeah, you said that a form is an aspect of an object's appearance that varies?
Right. Yes, it does. The question is, I defined a form, or I gave you as a description of a form, that it's an aspect of an object's appearance that depends on the way our senses respond to the object. Does that mean that there are aspects of the form that do not depend on the way our senses respond to the object? That would be slightly bizarre, because how can there be any aspect of appearance that doesn't depend somehow on our senses? This is why I hesitated to call this a definition. The point is this. In a sense, every aspect of an appearance depends on the way, both on the object and on our senses. It depends on the whole interaction. It's an integrated, holistic phenomenon. However, we can isolate by holding the object constant and varying the conditions of perception, or by varying the object and holding the conditions. I'm sorry, we can hold the object constant and then vary the conditions of perception, or we can hold the conditions constant and vary the object. Okay? And in the first case, where the object is constant, typically we perceive a constant object, okay? But the appearance varies. As when I rotate this, you all know that, in fact, this ellipse is not changing. Okay? Whereas if we held the conditions of perception constant and you suddenly notice this shrinking, okay, you would know that the object is, in fact, changing. So we can say that, although in a general way, every aspect of appearance depends both on the object and on the perceiver, we can, certain aspects depend primarily on, they're primarily due to the one or the other. And we can say at least that they vary in certain ways in accordance with the following sorts of variations. Okay. Yes?
Empiricist movement in philosophy, radical empiricism.
Yes, they were led to that conclusion. The question is that there was a movement called radical empiricism in philosophy of which Hume, well, in a sense, Hume was a radical empiricist. He usually refers to William James, who was a follower of Hume. This movement said that the given was sensations, and they were led to hold that perception is a kind of judgment based on sensations. What do I think of this? Do I think perception is a judgment? No. And I think this is a crucial point that I would argue as against sensationalism. If you say, think it through this way. A judgment is a conceptual thing. It involves saying that something has some property. That the lectern is brown, the lectern is whatever. I talked about this a lot last time. Now, that means that if you say perception involves judgment, you're saying perception already involves the conceptual level. You couldn't perceive until you had concepts. Well, then where would you get those concepts? That leaves you with only two alternatives. either we form concepts on the basis of sensations, okay, and then you're driven to the kind of human position that our concepts are arbitrary constructs, or you say that our concepts are innate. You're driven to the Kantian position, and that in fact, in psychology you have a battle between what's called empiricism and nativism often. The empiricists are the Humeans, the first side of that dilemma, and the nativists are the Kantians. But either way, it's hopeless because you're left without any foundation in reality for the conceptual level. So that's why I think this is a real fighting issue. Okay, in the back. Yes? The question is, do I regard perception as dependent on prior experience of sensations? I consider that a scientific issue. It seems to me that there are two possibilities. One, which I was suggesting seems to be supported increasingly by evidence, is that there is, for most normal people who mature normally, no prior sensational level experience. We start at the perceptual level and then we refine it and require new perceptual skills. However, other philosophers hold, or other psychologists hold rather, that we do start out at this sensational level in the way that William James thought, but that perception evolves out of it. In that case, you could say, in a sense, that perception depends on prior experience of sensations. But it's crucial to remember that if so, the dependence is a causal one. It's that you've got, at one level stage in your life, you perceive sensations, that does something to your nervous system, which allows you then to perceive, but the perception is automatic. The crucial thing you have to be careful of is the claim that perception depends epistemologically on sensation. That you have to make certain kinds of inferences to get from sensation to perception. That, I think, is the trap to avoid. Okay? Yes?
Yeah. Although you don't validate sense perception by proving it, you do have to prove the validity of particular senses, for instance, sight or the Zach's method of perceiving objects as opposed to clairvoyance or a sixth sense or something, don't you?
Okay, good question. We don't validate perception per se, I was arguing, but don't we have to validate that a certain mode of experience is a form of awareness or is perception? And for example, we would have to make the judgment that clairvoyance or ESP are not valid modes of experience. Yes. From the inside, when we look at the world, the fact that we are aware of objects is self-evident to us. But now if someone comes along and says, well, in addition to the five senses I've got, that you have, I have this sixth sense which allows me to perceive God or whatever. I perceive something that you cannot perceive. How am I supposed to interpret that? Since I can't look in his mind, I've got to ask myself, what evidence is there that this person has this faculty? Well, I would ask, can he make predictions that I can then confirm in terms of my own senses? All right? If you had sight in a land where everyone else was blind, and you said, look, I can see things, you guys can't, and they said, why should we believe that? You could say, well, there's something approaching you, and you're going to feel it in a minute. Okay? And you do that over and over again until they have enough confirmation. Secondly, you could specify what the causal basis for the sensory thing was. I mean, the faculty of sense perception has to have a causal basis. So if someone comes along and says, last night I saw the face of God in a vision, and it was a true vision, well, you have to ask, well, all right, I don't have that faculty, sorry. But I'm not sure you do either. Can you show me what the causal basis is? And where are the receptors? How's it happening? And if you can't answer that, then the person is left, in effect, saying, well, it happened by magic. And that we know, on first principles, is not. Okay. Anyone else? Yes, in the red shirt.
Yes, hi. I'm having a little bit of difficulty distinguishing between the representationalist
The question was, could I elaborate on the distinction between the representationalist view and the objectivist view? Okay? Let me do this at two levels. At the fundamental level, the representationalist view says consciousness is metaphysically active. It could originate all of its own contents. Okay? There are these consciousness and existence are two separate spheres that exist in this kind of metaphysical détente. Objectivism denies that. It says that the primacy of consciousness is true. Consciousness is metaphysically passive. Now, the second level, which I would help to answer, would be specifically in terms of perception. How can I distinguish the image that representationalists talk about from the form that objectivists talk about? Well, think of it this way. Here's the subject. Okay. Behind here is the mind's eye. Okay. This is the subject of awareness, whoever the perceiver. Representationalism says what we're directly aware of is an image. And then we can say that this image corresponds to a certain object. But we don't perceive the object. We see this thing, this image that's in the mind, which is a distinct entity in the mind, standing between us and the object. Okay? Whereas the objectivist view is we perceive the object. Okay? There's no image standing between us and the object. It's just that, and I don't know exactly how to represent this on a drawing. What? All right, yeah. That's a good idea. Okay? We perceive the object, but in a form. Okay? However, be careful. Don't think that the form is someplace between, is at this very location. Okay? The form really is a property of the entire interaction. Okay? So I hope that helps. Yes? Yes?
Earlier you mentioned
Let me repeat the question. What are these optometrists' tests that allow them to distinguish between those who are colorblind and those who have normal sight in those subtle cases where they have learned the same words and they don't know that they're perceiving abnormally? The tests are ones, I'm sure you've all seen them. They involve a whole pattern of dots in a little circle, and they've got numbers in a different colored dots. And the two colors are chosen in such a way that they're slightly different, or they're matchings that would appear differently to someone who's got the color blindness. Okay, but just they require a kind of the differences are so small or something that they normally you wouldn't notice it in real life.